Hello, it's me. I'm back. It's Jason from Custom Cans, and I'm just, as I get a lot of people ask all the time, do you reckon I could solder this for myself? I've not done any soldering before, and I always say no. That's a terrible idea. Do lots of practice. But I'm going to go through some basics, some different kinds of wire, some pitfalls, some stuff to look out for, some things that are going to trip you up when you're trying to solder a jack back onto a cable or something like that. So we'll go through some basics. But I would always say just have a lot of practice first, and eventually the soldering iron will respect you. So anyway, on with the thingamabob. So I'm going to go through a few tips and tricks if you're starting out with soldering, which will hopefully get you on the path. But as I said, don't dive straight in. I would have a play with some stuff that you don't mind about breaking first. So the basics, obviously, going to want a soldering iron, some solder. It's sometimes handy to have some flux as well, which matches your solder. Most solders have a flux core these days, so you don't necessarily need a separate flux, but it can make life a little bit easier. It helps transfer the heat and gets you a nicer solder joint often. PTFE tape is sometimes handy. This is plumber's tape, and you can wrap that round things to insulate them against each other if you're worried about things shorting out. What I was going to go through initially is different types of wire, because you're going to come across these. If you're making your own cables, or you've got an old school pair of headphones or audio cable, like a Grado or something, they still use this kind of wire. It's pretty straightforward. It's just wire. You can solder that nice and easily. It strips back nicely, as you can see. This would be a Teflon coated silver plated wire. Now Teflon is quite tough, and it's going to be difficult to strip back with normal wire strippers, so I'd probably score it with a scalpel around the edge or a sharp blade before you try and do it. Otherwise, you just won't be able to strip it. Let's see if we can strip that back. Tough. No, not enough. Oh, it's starting to go. Didn't score it all the way. There we go. So that's that. So Teflon is very popular on a lot of audio cables, but it's difficult to strip back. So a sharp knife will get you back at that. Yeah, so both these wires are pretty straightforward. You just need to tin them first. Tinning is where you add a little bit of solder before you solder it to a thing, just so it's soaked up with solder, and it'll make the whole process a little bit easier. Basically, you won't need to make the solder joint for as long if you get solder on both first. Other things to look out for if you're doing like speaker cables like this, which is quite fat. Now then, this is going to wick the heat away if you've got a fat cable like that. So when you're soldering it, you just need to bear that in mind and heat this up with the end of the soldering iron for a little while first before adding the solder. Otherwise, it's just not gonna work, because as soon as you touch the solder to it, it's going to cool down and solidify. So if you have got to solder something like this, what I'd recommend is get a bit of solder on your soldering iron, hold it to the end, and then let that heat up. Now I've got my soldering iron set to about 380. It'll depend on your solder as to how hot you want it, but eventually, once this is hot enough, the solder will wick into the copper. As you can see, this is taking a while to heat up. Probably need to turn my soldering iron up a bit hotter. But yeah, so that's how I'd do it. I'd basically heat that up and then feed in a bit more solder and let it kind of wick into the wire to tin it. So there you go. As you can see, that's working now. So that's wicking up into the wire. So now we've got solder all over that. And then once it's up to temperature, you can kind of maneuver it around. If you've got a fat wire, it's very rare that you end up soldering something this fat. And these thinner wires, much easier, but I'd use the same kind of principle. Get a little bit of solder on the end of your soldering iron, and then feed in a bit more as you heat up the wire. If you're making your own cables, these are probably the kind of wires that you're going to deal with mainly. So that's that tinned. Now then, what we use is a litz wire, and that has got many thin wires inside, but the difference with this stuff is the individual strands of wire each have a little coating over them that stops the electricity travelling from one to the other. So you need to remove that coating, and again, heat is going to be your friend on that one. You're probably going to need the soldering iron a bit hotter to do this, and we use silver solder, which is quite a high temperature solder. Again, I'm just going to get a little blob on the end, let it heat up and soak in, and that will basically melt off the coating on the wire at the same time. Whereas if you just try and solder straight to the side of it, you're only going to get the initial wire, the outside wires, holding it to the end and letting it wick up will get all the internal wires as well all covered in solder. So that is litz wire. It's a bit harder, but unfortunately most modern headphones have got reinforcement in them, which makes soldering something onto the end of them a bit of a nightmare. Well, this is an example here. This is a bare dynamic cable, and this is one of the better ones. It gets worse. So inside here you've got lots of wires. You've got your positive, negative and stuff, and then you've got these kind of Kevlar fibers in there. Now then, if you get that on your solder joints, it's going to mess it up. So what I would advise doing is separate out these wires from the reinforcement. So the reinforcement might be nylon or Kevlar or string, or there's various different things, but just snip that back before you start, and then you can strip your individual wires internally, the smaller wires separately. So when you get in, there's another surprise. I don't know if you can see this, but in between, in the actual inner wires, they've got fibers of Kevlar as well. Yeah, the trick to this is going to be to bend the copper wires down, just splay them out, and what will happen is they will stay where they are, bent down, and the reinforcement, the Kevlar, will spring back up like that. So then what you can do is you can snip that off and then bring these back up, and then that's got rid of the Kevlar reinforcement, which is going to make your job of soldering much easier. So the key is just have a really good look and see if there's any of these Kevlar fibers in there, or nylon or whatever. Just bend the copper wires away so that they separate out, and snip off the Kevlar. Okay, so that's the different kinds of wire, and as I said, a lot of headphones are going to be like these bare dynamic ones where they've got reinforcement in, which makes it a little bit harder. Next, obviously, the most common job will be to replace a jack. So next you've got a choice of jacks. So, you know, your basic super cheesy jacks are going to look like that on the inside, and they're quite slimline, which is nice. We used quite fat wire, so we tend to use fatter connectors, so like the Via Blue or these ones, which have got a bigger hole in the back there to take a bigger wire. But if you're starting out, I would recommend the Rean jacks, R-E-A-N. They're probably the easiest ones to solder to. They're very well made. They're kind of like the industry standard, and you get them in a standard body, or you can get extra wide ones and stuff. But if we have a look inside here, what makes these nice and easy to deal with is that they've got stakes to solder onto, so you've got big tabs to solder onto, which makes life a little bit easier. So if we look at something like this, so internally on this you've got these little poles to solder onto, and genuinely they're just a bit of a nightmare to solder to when you're first starting out. The Rean jacks, nice big space on there. So let us do this thing. Let us solder a jack onto a broken headphone cable, let's imagine. So we've got our bare dynamic cable here. Okay, so now we have our ends prepped. I've got rid of most of the Kevlar threads, which is good. Now, the tinning. So we're just going to add a blob of solder to the end of each of these to make them stick a little bit better. Keep your solder tip clean, that's my top tip there. Now I'm using silver solder, which is quite a nightmare to work with. You can get different temperature solders. This one's quite a high temperature one. So yeah, you need a decent soldering iron. As far as soldering irons go, I would recommend getting one with a temperature readout. You can pick that up relatively cheaply, sort of 30 or 40 pounds off Amazon or eBay, and they do the job. You know, they're Chinese clones of branded soldering irons, and they do the job. I don't know if you noticed that, but that solder blob did not stick to the wire, and that is probably because I left a couple of Kevlar fibers in there. So yeah, you just want nice shiny clean solders on there. If it's all crusty, black bits in it, that's normally a bad sign. This one's gone a bit crusty. I suspect there were Kevlar fibers still in there, just messed with the solder. Cool, right, I think we're there. Those all look pinned. Now then, normal headphone jack is known as a TRS jack, which is tip, ring, sleeve. And they are wired left plus, right plus, and then a shared ground. And the center pin will be this tip, and then the outer one will be the ring, and then this thing that's also crimps the cable, that's where the ground connects to on these particular jacks. It'll be different on different jacks, but that's kind of the standard way of doing it. With this, it's always worth getting a multimeter. You can pick these up for like £6 or £7. They're very straightforward. And I'm going to put it to continuity, which will go beep if there's a connection, and then we can just double check what colours are what. So the ground. If you're doing this, if you've chopped the jack end off, what I'd do is I'd check the wires on the bit that you've cut off, so you can figure out what colour's what. And I'm just sticking a jack on both ends of this one. So we've got ground, which is black, right, which I suspect is the red one, yeah, and then left is white. Okay, now I'm just going to use a pair of pliers to open up the cable clamp on this a bit wider so we can get the wire in there. I don't know what the technical term for it is, but we call this bit that you screw on the back the bum, and the bit that the wire goes into is the bum hole, because we are as grown-ups, isn't it? Anyway, so slide the bum on first, because if you forget, you're going to have a bad time because you can't get this on. Otherwise you have to desolder everything, which will suck. So put the bum on. Next I'm going to do the ground wire, and I find it easiest to bend that down and solder it on there. Solder it on behind the others and then underneath. And what I'm going to do is, like we did with the wire, I'm just going to add a little bit of solder to all the places I want to connect the wires to. So I'm going to put a little bit on there, and because this is quite a big bit of metal, remember that's going to take a little bit longer to heat up. There you go. Did you see the wire, the solder just suddenly lose its surface tension and stick to the metal? That's when you know it's hot enough. If it bubbles up, if you end up with a bobble of it, that means it hasn't stuck properly and you haven't got enough heat into the joint. So these smaller stakes are going to solder much quicker, just because they've got as much thermal mass. So I'm going to solder that there. That's the ground wire. And did you see it all flow nicely? Ooh, it's a beautiful thing. Now right is this one. There we go, and then the left one. And if you can't get these to stick like I did there, just put a bit of fresh solder on your soldering iron, and that will help the solder remelt a bit more easily. As you can see, you've got a cable clamp on the back here that kind of secures it all together. So I want to make sure I get some of the meat of the cable in that and then squeeze it down. Now this is burning my fingers currently, so I'm going to put it down. Ah! Warning, when soldering, things may become hot. Okay, squozen down. So that'll mean when you yank on the cable, it's not going to yank the solder joints off, hopefully. Let's get that around there. Put that on. Et voila! The soldered jack. Now then, at this point, use your multimeter again, just to make sure that everything's soldered securely and that you haven't got bridges. Bridges are also a thing to look out for. So we're going to go ground, happy days, right, good, left, good. Now then, you also want to check that the ground isn't connected to those and that those two aren't connected. You should not get a beep on those, because if it can happen where you accidentally drag a little bit of solder across or something like that, or a little stray little pube of wire touches it and causes a bridge. Now as you can see, I've used a wide boy jack, which is entirely too fat for this cable. I wouldn't get something more that kind of size. But it was good as just an example. So what you get with more expensive jacks, as I said, the cheapy cheaps, they're not too bad, but everything's just a little bit flimsy, and you also have to solder onto these round pins, which is a bit more difficult. As I said, the Reens are good. They're a couple of quid. Oh, that's a mono one, but yeah. If you go expensive, you can get something like the Via Blue, which are beautifully made. Like, it's a lovely thing, but I'm not sure they're quite as easy to solder to as the Reen ones if you're starting out. So I probably wouldn't go to the more expensive ones unless you've already got the hang of stuff, because you're going to end up ruining them. They kind of assume that you know what you're doing by the time you're buying sort of 10 or 15 quid jacks. So that's it. So we've got basic soldering, different kinds of wire, different kinds of jacks. Is there anything else? Oh yeah, another thing, if you are making your own cables, you might want to cover it in something, or again, if you've got a cable and you want to give it a bit of protection, there's various things that you can use to cover them. So we, on a lot of our cables, we use this, which is a parachute cord. 4mm parachute cord is what we use. You can get it in different thicknesses. The thinner stuff is going to give you a more compact cable. You can get cotton rope. If you get one with a central core like that, you can basically remove the core and then stuff your wires inside that, which is cotton, so it's nice because it's a natural fibre. It's going to catch a little bit more than it won't be quite as durable as the nylon, but it does have a nice soft feel. It's going to be less microphonic. What you'll see on a lot of professional cables is this stuff, which is Tech Flex, and it expands as you push it over stuff, so it's quite small, but if you push it over that, it'll expand over your jacks, make covering things a bit easier. So that stuff's quite easy to use. The disadvantage of this is it's quite scratchy and microphonic, so it's great for a pro application where you're going to be using it in high noise environments, or using it on things like keyboards and stuff like that where the sound doesn't matter. But for home listening on headphone cables, things like that, I wouldn't get these because you're going to hear it in the headphones. But for covering, like if you're making your own RCA cables or something, it's good for that, nice and easy to use. Anyway, I hope that was vaguely interesting and useful. If you've got any questions, stick them in the thing below. If you'd like to see anything more specific, like how to solder certain balance connectors or headphone connectors, that kind of stuff, because we do it here all the time, and they've all got their little quirks. If there's something in particular that you'd like to see, let me know, and I'll see if I can shoot another video. But anyway, it's been super awesome hanging out. Jason out. Hey, you're looking good. What are you wearing? Nice. Nice. Sexy. Sexy.